Well, welcome to the first in a series of shows called The Conversation. I'm Sam Kiley. I am the World Affairs Editor here at The Independent, and I'm joined by Dr Ellehuus, who is the Director General now of the Royal United Services Institute, which is the institute for the brainiest people in the world thinking about security matters. And alongside Rachel is Sir Alex Younger, former chief of the Secret Intelligence Service, otherwise known as MI6. We live in genuinely, terrifyingly interesting times, I think, which is why I'm so excited that you're both here to try and help unpick it for us. Because of the recent events, Alex, I'm going to go straight in on the kind of intelligence snafu, really, that we've seen unfold recently in Washington. The use of the Signal Group, very high, your former equivalents, director of the CIA, head of the National Intelligence Agency, Secretary of State for Defense, the Middle East envoy at the time in Russia on his personal phone, part of this whole debacle. But those are my words. Was it, I mean, as a former spy chief, what would your reaction have been if these were your people?
Well, I think, look, it's the whole administration is a discontinuity. Almost by definition, it's a break with the past, and that has led to Trump appointing a set of people who are completely new, and that's that's by design, and they don't come from the security establishment as I would see it, and there's a whole set of consequentials that stem from that. Not least, of course, conferring on the president the ability to do things pretty differently. Whatever you think about that, it comes at a cost just in terms of a basic understanding of the environment in which we all operate and the threats that exist. On the face of it, using a phone, an iPhone, or wherever it is to plan an attack you don't want to know your enemy about is not, that you don't want your enemy to know about is not sensible. And it's ironic in particular because just at the end of last year, the previous administration advertised a set of discoveries about Chinese malware, Volt Typhoon and Salt Typhoon, which illustrated that China and its intelligence service, more or less at will, can be present on anybody's phone, including in the United States. So with an app like Signal, it is true that the conversation between you and the other phone is completely encrypted, and it's true that that is uncrackable. But if the Chinese, or whoever it might be, are on your phone, it's going to make no difference. So there's a basic education issue here. I would hope that lesson's been learned. You asked me how I would react. My view generally when I was in charge is that you can make a mistake once, but you absolutely don't make a mistake twice. So let's see what happens.
And it was a pretty big mistake to be holding a phone of that kind of vulnerability in the Russian capital, having just come from the Gulf.
Let's call it a learning experience, and let's see what happens next.
Rachel, how did you react when you saw that? I mean, you've spent a great chunk of your career in highly confidential conversations as an envoy, effectively to NATO, for the Secretary of Defense, among other roles that you've played. Would you have imagined anything like this ever occurring?
Well, I was also shocked that Signal was being used for those types of conversations. In regular circumstances, at least what I was used to, is that there would be a very deliberate, what we call interagency process that brings people into the White House, sometimes connected from the Pentagon and State Department via virtual connections, via video, but those would be all secure communications at varying levels of government. And then those decisions would be taken very deliberately, and the information would be kept very close hold, because after all, let's remember, we're talking about strikes here. And so the lives of the service members from whence those strikes are coming, whether it was a ship or elsewhere, that's not a standoff capability where they could move out of harm's way very quickly. So I would be worried about force protection in the first instance. I didn't also see much of a conversation about precision of targeting, concern about civilian casualties, how we were coordinating with allies who might have forces in the region. I'm not just talking about Europeans, but there could have been other Middle Eastern countries with whom we're working who could have been in the vicinity. So what is usually a very deliberate, in-person, secure process was played out in front of us, complete with emojis.
Bizarre. Frankly.
Very strange.
I mean,
unusual.
I was stunned. I mean, because what intrigued me was the fact that they all seem to be on their personal phones. And I know from my own communications with people involved in the intelligence community, one has to go through quite deliberate series of rigmaroles just to have a perfectly natural conversation. It just seemed absolutely bizarre to me. Do you think, Rachel, that we've seen the Canadian response to this, which was to publicly, from the former head of Canadian intelligence, to suggest that, and in fact then the Prime Minister too, saying this is going to put Five Eyes, the important Anglosphere system for intelligence sharing, under pressure, given that Trump has been notoriously slack about intelligence and security in the past anyway. Do you think it is under pressure?
That's a big question. I hope not, because we have seen, and Alex will live this firsthand, we've seen the value of intelligence in validating facts on the ground. We saw it most sharply in the run-up to the war on Ukraine, when we were able to use a combination of open source information and intelligence from a number of allies to validate what the Russians were doing on the ground. We could see the force movements, we could see the forward positioning of blood banks, and that painted a picture that you wouldn't get from individual sources of intelligence. So it really is the strength of what each ally, not just Five Eyes, but all 32, in a NATO context, bring into the conversation that allows you to act with rigor and as full a picture as possible, even if it will be incomplete.
Alex, do you think that they can be trusted with this sort of sensitive intelligence?
Well, it's a good question, because at the end of it all, an alliance is a trust thing, and Donald Trump sees it as a transaction in some ways, but I think everyone needs to understand it's a trust thing. Article 5 is a trust thing. And the Five Eyes really is a trust thing. We are astonishingly transparent with one another. And that has been to mutual gain, profound mutual gain over the years. So it's a good question. I've lived this. So I was chief when Donald Trump was last in office. And some of the stuff you refer to happened then. So it's got to be a cause of concern. But what I would say is that from a professional perspective, we're all on the same side. People talk about sources and methods, very dry term. Methods, is how we do intelligence and how we derive intelligence, and that is indeed very sensitive and must be protected. Sources are people, real people who are behind the lines, who've decided to take a risk to keep all of us safe. And for us as intelligence practitioners, their protection is tantamount to a sacred duty. Now, that makes this personal, and in a sense that gives me some confidence, because I know that my CIA colleagues will die in a ditch rather than see those sources compromised in whatever way. And that's kind of what we want to know and hear. And we're the same, and they would expect the same of us. So I don't negate the fact that it all starts and ends at the top, but the reality is, professionally, my former colleagues will be organised to make sure that we can keep the people who've decided to throw in their lot with us safe.
There's a very interesting way that you put it, and I can see in your face a kind of, genuine emotional attachment to, because from real world experience, no doubt you've, had people who've been risking making the ultimate sacrifice. I hope none of them have ever had to pay the price. But the fact is that the people running the CIA, running the National Intelligence Agency now, have been, sort of hand-picked for ideological reasons. And that's not new. That happens normally. Traditionally, there is an element of political crossover. But these particular characters must be seen internally as difficult to dangerous by those CIA operatives and leaders that you refer to, who do have that sacred bond with their agents.
Look, I just don't know. I'm not inside. I can't speculate, but I do know what I've just said, which is that the professional cadre will be completely invested in the protection of their sources. And whilst this is, I agree with you, a pretty extraordinary time, actually we've had this interface between the professional and the political. It's part of our accountability, actually. It's what we do. It's the difference between us and our opponents. It's something we've always had to mediate. Now, I don't negate your point, Sam. It is a very unusual time. But all I am saying when it comes to the defence of the integrity of our capabilities as five, there will be a very, very strong machine in operation to retain the integrity, even if I can't belittle the idea that it's more at risk than it was.
Okay, so that's given us the sort of immediate thing, and please feel free to ask one another questions and interject. Then let's take a look at Ukraine in the sort of broad, and then we may probably drill down. I mean, and I know, of course, what both of you have your positions on Ukraine, but Rachel, what do you think ultimately is the Russian agenda when it comes to Ukraine? Is there any real possibility, for example, that a ceasefire, whether a long or even a short one, would result in a safe Ukraine, free from the threat of a Russian invasion?
Well, it's difficult to speculate on how far this goes and what's going through the Russian mind. But given what we've seen over the last 3 years, I think it's fair to speculate that President Putin's trying to redraw the map. Some of the changes that were made at the end of the Cold War that left Ukraine, Georgia, Moldova as not part of the Soviet Union, but neither part of NATO or the European Union, left them in a kind of limbo, created an opportunity for him to chip away at the margins of those countries and create pockets of instability or insecurity that would prevent them from fully integrating into NATO or the EU. So in terms of territorial conquest, I don't know exactly how far he would go. Would he go all the way to Kiev to try to take over the entire country and subsume it into Russia as a whole? I'm not certain about that. It might be enough to achieve his objectives just to take pieces of Ukraine, take the ports, take the highways, take critical infrastructure that is really important to Ukraine's survival as an independent state. That might be enough to achieve his objectives of preventing them from ever becoming members of NATO or the EU. But I will say I think he has a secondary objective, which people sometimes overlook, and that is to really challenge and undermine NATO and the European Union. Now, am I saying he's going to invade the Baltic states or Poland tomorrow? I'm not, but he is going to test the boundaries of what we call Article 5, which is the feeling or the commitment that an attack against one NATO ally is an attack against all of them. He's already been pushing the boundaries of that through below the threshold activities that aren't conventional attacks, but things like, we've seen weaponization of migrants, a couple of situations where he's taken migrants in Russia, put them up against the border of Norway or Poland, and pushed them over in order to create instability, unrest, and to test whether Poland and Norway would respond in a balanced way, because then that would open them to criticism. So we've got that primary objective of preventing Ukraine's full Western integration and viability as an independent state. And then we have that secondary, probably bigger objective of undermining the Western structures.
But Al, do you see it as a matter of sort of, is it an imperial agenda that Putin has?
Yeah, I think of necessity. What does Putin have to offer the Russian people, really? He offers them security, and that's beguiling for Russians because of the disaster of the democratic experiment, which the West is semi-complicit in, by the way. But I think when he came to power, there was a craving for security, and he puts himself out there. He's Mr. Hardman as security. Of course, what you need in that environment, though, is a threat. Particularly, by the way, when you have no other offer. Because fundamentally what the Russians are buying is a corrupt oligarchy that is ripping them off. But it's doing so because it craves security. Security needs a threat. And I think at the beginning, the threat was that Russia was fundamentally falling apart, and Putin did fix that. But now, of course, Putin feels the need to take this to another level. And I think Putin doesn't have a rationale unless he's in a permanent state of antagonism, specifically with Europe. And so this needs to continue. Now, you don't need a spy to tell you this. He kind of said it before the invasion. So we were clever as spies in revealing his attack plans, which completely lent the lie to the idea that this was some kind of defensive maneuver. Rubbish. But what the really revealing bit came before there in August 21, where he wrote an essay, complete with spelling mistakes. It was definitely him, about the destiny of Ukraine and Russia. Unity, I think, was even the word. And that revealed his sense that Russia just isn't complete without Ukraine, and the implication that the reverse is also true. You've got stuff, the sort of Russian mythology, Ruski Mir, all invested in Ukraine. He made it super clear that Ukraine's existence was inimical to Russian greatness. And to Rachel's point, by the way, in the same essay, he made it really clear that the choices that former Warsaw Pact states had made to throw in their lot with the West, i.e. join NATO, also represented an illegitimate infringement of Russian sovereignty. In all of this, what he's doing is talking about something that we're very familiar to our predecessors in 1945. He's talking about spheres of influence. And he has his idea of a Russian sphere of influence. And I don't think he's going to stop until that has been re-established. And I think that's his offer, couched as a Russian reinvigoration, I suppose. But that's his offer. So we need to be hard-headed about this. He's not going to invade Warsaw tomorrow, but he's going to continue, I agree entirely with Rachel, primarily, at least initially, through unconventional means, just chipping away. And what have we learned? If you don't stand up to him, he comes back for more. How many more times do we need to be told this?
Well, because we've seen Georgia, we've seen
Georgia, Syria, Crimea,
Chechnya.
You name it, Chechnya.
Over and over again. I mean, what fascinates me as someone who comes from Africa is that when he was operating in the Georgian sphere, I recognized it immediately as classic apartheid-era destabilisation campaigns. And similarly in Crimea, everybody was talking about hybrid warfare as though it had just been invented. And I was going, no, this is normal. You dress up as the other side, and in the case of the apartheid regime, would go across the border, commit atrocities, get them blamed internally, and clear off. It was we've seen this time and time and time again. But have we in Europe appreciated, do you think, the strategic shift that we're engaged in? I mean, I sometimes say, some are born in moments of history. If you're born in Afghanistan, you're born into history, and it's happening to you. But some of us, in this case, it's sort of being thrust upon us. We've had a lovely complacent time for the last several decades, 8 decades or so, in the West, and now we are in a position in which we've got to kind of butch up.
I would say that the bigger shock that's really going to wake up Europeans is the behavior of the United States lately. I was at NATO during the 2022 Russian invasion of Ukraine, and sure, there was, some bustling. This is outrageous. We have to do something. We have to step up. Putin's really crossed a line here. And you saw some changes. You saw the Germans increase defense spending. You saw them get rid of some export control regulations. You saw the UK find a leadership role in Europe and really push for Ukraine's integration into the West. But largely speaking, defense budgets didn't rise significantly. People didn't take hard decisions and reorient their economies towards a war footing. But honestly, as you were speaking about essentially the Russian playbook, and Russia needing some sort of security, needing an external enemy or some sort of enemy in order to kind of galvanize support for that leader, I found myself thinking about a lot of the behaviors of President Trump, frankly. Who are the enemies? The enemies are migrants, wokeism, Europeans. It's quite shocking when you think
It's shocking
about
in
the
that he
parallels.
sounds like he's Putin.
Absolutely. or that he's using the same instruments to create fear and otherness in order to, that is, as Sir Alex said, that's the offer. The offer isn't really more efficient government, more jobs back in the United States, lower prices for the American people, all the things that were promised on the campaign. I don't see those materializing. What I do see materializing are, deportations, angry words for our allies, kind words for our adversaries, cracking down on all the soft power elements like freedom of the media, freedom of speech that we've come to value and be known by as the United States. So that's what terrifies me. So to your question, I hope if there is a wake-up call and a galvanizing moment, it will be that.
The galvanizing moment for Europe.
Yes.
Well, let's take a look at the Trump-Putin relationship, or the MAGA-Putin relationship, because, and I've written about this, and so I'm sort of testing my own thesis against grown-ups, if you like, but by now, it's no longer interesting to me whether or not he is actually a Russian agent, as has been alleged in the past, with no proof whatsoever, but that he behaves, and one can be sure that he will behave as if he were taking instructions from the Kremlin. And that's my working assumption now. Am I wrong, Alex?
I mean, who knows? I personally don't think he's a Russian agent. I went on my way not to find out, because why would you want to know, etc. So I don't know.
It's very wise.
Yeah,
You become chief for nothing.
But as you'll say, in a sense, that's not the point. The point is he agrees with Vladimir Putin. He agrees that big countries get additional rights over small countries, particularly in their own backyard. So he's a spheres of influence guy. Look at how he's behaving in the Western Hemisphere with Panama and Greenland and Canada, etc. This is what he does. And his vision, I think, is sort of Westphalian. It's a balance of powers in the world, but specifically with Xi Jinping, Vladimir Putin, and Donald Trump in its center. And in those terms, what Putin says about Ukraine and his rationale, which is fundamentally that Ukraine got out of line and didn't understand it was in the Russian sphere of influence, I don't think he really sees he doesn't see what's wrong with that.
He basically agrees with it on a sort of strategic level.
Yeah, so there's a bias, and this is what makes me worried about what's going on. I think there's broadly speaking, a bias towards the idea that Russia has more rights than Ukraine because it's a bigger country. By the way, that's basically why Xi Jinping is sympathetic to the Russian cause. I mean, there's a lot of other stuff going on, but fundamentally, it's an offence to his political view of the world that a small country gets the same rights as a big country. He sort of said that, and Xi Jinping's really clear. He says rather disingenuously that all countries should have independent rights to follow their own interests, but that's really about China's heft, China being able to use its heft and make the rules. So when Putin does that, Xi Jinping hasn't got a problem, and increasingly Donald Trump hasn't got a problem. The people who've got a problem are the people who are built on the new order, where states have rights regardless of their size, and that's called Europe, which is why this is such a shock to us.
It is an extraordinary shock. I mean, you here in Europe, it's quite intriguing to me the extent to which there's still a kind of wry laughter when Trump makes remarks about turning Canada into the 51st state, or not ruling out troops to invade Greenland. The Danish have just sent special forces onto the ground to protect Greenland against fellow NATO ally, the United States of America, who also have a military base there. Obviously, that is the wake-up call that you referred to there, Rachel. But I mean, do you agree with Alex that this is just a simple kind of, well, not simple, but it's about spheres of influence, or is there something more sinister going on?
Well, I would agree with Alex that bias is there. The way that President Trump sees the world is very different, and it is partial to big states. The part that really he kind of lacks an understanding is, from whence does that American power come? Why is it? Is it just because the United States is big geographically? Well, if that's the case, then there are other countries who would be more powerful. So I think he misses a trick in not really stopping to think, why can the US behave in this way, where it has outsized influence, where countries around the world are holding their breath and checking Twitter every morning to see what Donald Trump has said. it is not because we've thrown our weight around in an ugly way. It's because we have had that choice, but have chosen to, generally speaking, work together with allies and friends and try to defend the interests of small states, smaller countries, because there's this underlying belief that it magnifies our own power. So the credibility and the trust upon which the US can behave as it currently does all derives from the fact that we have allies and partners around the world. And so that's the piece that I miss in this. It's not, the United States' power is not inherent. It is not God-given. It is not exceptionable. It has been built over decades.
By the way, I think Xi Jinping agrees with that. So Donald Trump has an idea that it's martial might that commands respect. The thing that scares Xi Jinping is not a US aircraft carrier. It's a sense of the teamwork which only democratic countries are capable of generating. And he obsessively talks about containment, encirclement, block mentality. All of this is a complaint against what Rachel absolutely identifies correctly as our strongest, our greatest strength, which is our capacity for teamwork and our alliances. So where I differ violently with the new president is that this is somehow a net liability for America. And this will be the historical tragedy, because it manifestly isn't. He's right, there has been freeloading. It's actually good that Europe's been prodded into action. I think this is a positive. But don't throw out the baby with the bathwater.
You've written 2 major papers, books on the ability of the European nations. As you look at it now, with the efforts going on to build the coalition of the willing and so on, are the Europeans going to be able to put something together to somehow protect Ukraine in time, given, I think, that Trump is going to abandon the Ukrainians?
I believe that if the political will is there and European countries are able to work in a concerted, deliberate way to continue the support that's been given to Ukraine to hold its own in the fight against Russia, I think they can hold out. Now, even under the current form of assistance, a lot of people had their doubts about whether the conflict would come to a resolution on the battlefield. The Russians are unable to hold the territory that they've won at great cost. Equally, the Ukrainians probably can't entirely force the Russians out of all of their territory. So we were always moving towards a situation where at some point there will have to be some sort of a ceasefire and some sort of a negotiation. But can the Europeans keep the Ukrainians in the fight? Absolutely. And I believe there are signs that Russia is under pressure on the battlefield. And probably can't hold out that long. So I think it's definitely worth it. The tricky bit is that helping Ukraine will come at a cost to European readiness. So if we believe that Russian designs are beyond Ukraine, Europeans have to be very careful to make sure that they don't support Ukraine to the degree where they take risk on NATO territory or EU territory. You have to kind of change your mindset and think about Ukraine as part of Europe, even if institutionally they aren't members of NATO and the EU. So the types of arrangements I hope Europeans are thinking about is, when you think about ground-based air defense and air cover, well, a lot of those systems could be based in Poland or Slovakia, but in practical terms, they actually could provide air cover for Ukraine and ground-based air defense for Ukraine from NATO territory or EU territory.
It's quite interesting that Meloni has said, apropos of a reassurance force, don't bother with that, let's just give them Article 5 status, which, given that she's often associated with being quote-unquote pro-Trump, I don't think she is, to be fair to her, but that was an interesting, it's kind of what you're saying to some extent.
It is, but if you create those kinds of expectations and guarantees, you have to be willing to enforce them. It's not Article 5, but a couple of in Syria, for example, we set red lines, and if a red line is crossed and you then don't turn around and enforce that, then the whole house of cards falls. NATO's Article 5 is really the holy grail of security guarantees. So if you're going to go that direction, yes, absolutely. The implication is that if that line is crossed or that is tested, there will be another force coming in behind it.
Do you think, Alex, do you think we have the mettle in Europe anymore for this?
I don't know. I worry. I think we've disarmed militarily, self-evidently. We've largely dismantled our military industrial base, which is also a big problem. But I think culturally also there's an issue. We've, for many years, been completely free of any form of existential threat. We've unforgivably, and of course my generation as part of this, launched a set of wars of choice which have imposed sacrifice needlessly on young people. And there's great cynicism about this idea of collective effort to defend your country. I think we're more comfortable thinking about the army as like the England football team. They go and do their thing over there and we kind of watch it on telly. And that can't happen anymore. The answer to your question, in truth, Sam, is that it really depends on how close to Moscow you are. I think in Finland it's well understood, and there's a properly integrated, resilient culture where everyone is accustomed to playing their part. I think we go to Portugal at the other end, that's just not true. And in a sense, that's understandable. So it's got to be a work in progress. I think the UK is quite conflicted as well. We've got this astonishing history which makes people readier to conceive of Britain playing a much more active role. But I think here too there's real concern about being asked to actually do stuff. Putin and Trump together, as we've discussed, have done their best to persuade us that the rules have changed. I think that probably comes into place over time. And actually, in the end, I think you also loop back to something that besets all Western countries at the moment, which is the fact that they're not growing economically anymore. And I'm pretty confident this whole conversation would be a lot easier if we rediscover economic growth, because then we can allocate to this task and be more creative and have much more room. So in a sense, all of the Western government's main problem is still their main problem.
Yeah.
It's economic innovation.
Economic innovation, sort of economic, ultimately stagnation, an aging population. But you're suggesting there also, we have children of, we have fighting age males in the family. Should these young men and women be in the United Kingdom, for example, be thinking about joining up, becoming a reservist? You know, is there something the government should be doing? Is there a cultural shift that somebody has to drive?
I think there's an independent cultural argument. So you'd have to ask a soldier about the actual efficacy of things like conscription. I have no idea. But I know that the military should be a much more, I was a soldier myself, I know that it just needs to be a more integrated feature of everyday life. And I think that will bring broader benefits. So I think this is probably more about a more creative and broader conception of what the reserves is, getting people within touching distance of this thing, which at the moment is just seen as other. But eventually it really isn't going to be other.
How close are we, Rachel, to danger?
I would like to think all is not lost, and that we are seeing some of the cracks and fissures in time to actually do something about it. This argument of U.S. secretaries of defense or presidents saying Europeans need to step up and spend more, do more, take on more of the responsibility in their own theater, that's not new. It's just the urgency and the tone with which it's being said is a bit different than in the past. So,
and they have galvanized.
Absolutely,
they are having an effect, right?
So to go, to the question about growth, I'm pretty excited about the recent announcements that Germany has made, because not only are they saying they're going to put more money towards defense industry and ramping up production, which will create growth in the German economy and across Europe, they're also going to do the same for infrastructure to make sure that it's resilient and up to the task of moving heavy tanks across Europe if need be. So there are some bright spots here. I think people are waking up to the scale of the challenge, and there are shining examples. I mean, Finland really is a good one where even if you're a pro football player or you're a musician, you know how to operate a gun. You have probably some sort of reserves in order to be able to survive in your home without electricity or water for about 2 weeks' time. And it's that kind of a mindset that does scare people a bit if they're not used to thinking that way.
But you're talking about introducing a prepping culture to Britain.
Absolutely. In fact, I think the UK and all NATO allies are working on national resilience plans. Some already have them. I don't believe the UK did, or if they did, it was not kind of up to to where it needed to be. So we are going through a period. The Swedes have actually done a brilliant thing. They have a pamphlet that's called If War Comes. And every household has been given one of these, and it's their responsibility to create that resilience mindset. So no, I don't think we're on the brink of war. I think we're still talking to each other. We're still sharing intelligence. We're still operating together. We're still around that table at NATO. And Europeans are doing a lot of what the Trump administration has been asking, and frankly, those long before them.
Alex, do you think that how do we get from a bucolic complacency in this country to people storing tin food at home?
Well, look, on the one hand, I don't think it's credible for people like me to claim that there's going to be an emergency tomorrow. So we need to be careful and studious, as Rachel obviously is being, in terms of how we describe the threat. But on the other hand, we need to be really clear that the world we were in before was not the real world. It was the US security guarantee, and then that was always going to end, regardless of Donald Trump, and we are going to own our own future. And my point is, I think that could actually be quite an exhilarating experience. I think this relationship with the United States has become dangerously unbalanced. We've become infantilized. We've lost agency. And in doing so, have lost our willingness and capacity to innovate on our own account and invest in our own future. There's a whole set of things here that can happen as a consequential from an undesirable fact, which is that we're in a more dangerous world. But when it comes to driving innovation, or altering the balance of our economies, or even some of the cultural stuff you raised, there are opportunities here. And oddly, I think this new government in the UK, it felt a bit sort of directionless at the beginning, but it has sensed in this a way to galvanise government across the piece. Now, to your question, it's not going to happen overnight, but there is something going on, and Germany was genuinely a huge surprise on the upside. If Germany rearming is not the key, is not the thing, it will not solve the whole problem. But if they don't, there's no chance of anything happening. So it is genuinely significant what's going on there.
And at the end of the day, how long have they got? I wrote recently that if the Ukrainians can hang on for a year, they could win this war. Am I wrong?
The two things are related. What worries me most about the so-called conversations around a ceasefire that are happening now is the fact that the Ukrainians have been given quite a few concessions. Certain things have been taken off the table, like NATO membership, U.S. boots on the ground, et cetera. Conversely, the Russians have been given an opening to continue to attach conditions to the ceasefire. And when I look at those conditions that they're floating, they are things that are deliberately designed to put Russia in a position where they can start to reconstitute. So take, for example, this request to open up the Black Sea again. The Turks have been very diligent in enforcing the Montreux Convention and not allowing Russian warships to go back and forth into the Black Sea. Ukraine would be in a much more difficult position absent that enforcement. So the idea that they could ask for a concession around Black Sea security whereby sanctions were lifted, that is a deliberate ploy to put themselves in a better position to keep fighting on. So I think the trick here is to keep the pressure on. Because how much time do we have? I would say that if the pressure stays on and Europeans are serious and the Russians continue to feel pressure, you've got 5 to 10 years, but absent that probably goes down by half. And we're talking maybe 3 to 5 years. Before Russia is able to reconstitute, continue to push into Ukraine and possibly other places. Let's remember, although their land force has been pretty decimated, the air and naval forces are largely intact. And the nuclear capabilities in the northeast corner of Europe, up and around the Kola Peninsula, are absolutely intact. And Putin has shown he's willing to threaten tactical nuclear use in order to compel and threaten. So we don't have a lot of time, and even absent reconstitution, that Russian threat is not going away.
And during this period, we're also likely to see, and we have seen, and the European leaders have drawn attention to this sort of hybrid warfare attacks, obviously continued efforts to subvert Western democracy, infiltrate, carry out direct action in terms of sabotage. I'm wondering if we're going to see more of that and any opportunities for the Russians to combine with fundamentalist groups coming out of the Middle East, other kind of, my enemy's enemy is my friend type synergy, Alex, because none of those threats have evaporated, have they?
Yeah, I think we are as Western liberal democracies, very vulnerable to the hybrid. The reality is that we are law-based systems which to operate need to have boundaries. So the most obvious is the legal difference between peace and war. But there's also quite different between domestic and international. There's a whole set of things where we, for governance reasons, constrain our response. The Russians have worked this out, and they have a doctrine which is to cross across all of these categories in pursuit of very clearly defined national security objectives. It's called the Gerasimov doctrine. It isn't actually. Gerasimov was actually describing something he said we were doing to them. But anyway, so this is something we've got to deal with, and it's tough for us because we're not prepared to do stuff appropriate for war when it's peace. We don't have time to go into all of it now, but I think at the base needs to be an elevated capacity for partnership and teamwork. We must be able to work across borders. In the UK, the Foreign Office and the Ministry of Defence should have a huge overlap. In the intelligence agencies, the same. There's a real premium now on interoperability, using capabilities, the same capabilities for different purposes. You've got to rethink the way we do stuff. And then that is also true internationally, and it puts a premium on alliances. But I'm sure a challenge you will have wrestled with, Rachel, is the problem is with Article 5, it embodies this boundary, the difference between peace and war, and yet we're being attacked underneath our boundaries. So there's a whole set of stuff to do, and on top of that, there's this issue of societal resilience, which the hybrid war is very much designed to undermine with disinformation and all of that. I would say this was I come from the community. I think we're absolutely capable of dealing with this. We have extremely capable security and intelligence communities. We have very good alliances, but it does require us to recognize that this is taking place and to organize to effect. And in a sense, in that respect, it's consistent with everything else we've been talking about. We just cannot be complacent about this.
But that complacency is one of the things that that intrigues me, because it's the sort of othering of threat, in that it happens to other people or it happens to different locations. And I think back to the days of the IRA, when if you saw an unattended bag, you got very anxious as a small boy. If you saw we were all programmed to be vigilant. Now we are very vulnerable to misinformation in the internet sphere. We haven't even touched on AI, mainly because I don't understand it. But we've got a series of metastasizing threats. Do we, even in the European context, have the ability to counter them? And how do we counter them without the Americans? Because they've gone, right? They're not coming back.
Well, I wouldn't say we've gone.
Well, we're very lucky that you're still here.
But the metaphor that a lot of people use is supporting and supported. That would be the military way to say it. The United States has said, I think Secretary of Defense Hegseth has said, we don't want to take a leading role in responsibility for European security on the continent. I think Obama called it leading from behind. So there are different manifestations of this, but essentially, if you think about a car and, you hand over the keys to your teenager and you say, go off and drive, you can't tell them then, in perpetuity how to drive the car. So to Alex's point, there is agency here. And as Europeans are put in a position where they have to do more, and Big Brother or Big Sister USA is not standing there telling them how to drive the car, they will develop that agency and those reflexes. And mindsets can change. In the space of hybrid activities, if I even think about a year ago or 2 years ago, if you would look at some of the business associations, and when they would experience cyber attacks or hybrid attacks or arsons in their warehouses, their response would be, that's not really my responsibility. I'm a business person. I don't care about national security. I could do business in Russia. I could do a business in Iran. I can do business in the PRC. But I would be challenged to find many business leaders who now, these days, don't take security and risk into consideration in organizing their businesses. So this mindset change has happened, and I think we've got to continue to empower individual citizens, the private sector, non-defense departments of government to not really be paranoid about everything, but as you said, to look at things with a different lens than you may have. In Finland a couple years ago, there was a small archipelago, and it was a house of an oligarch. But why would this oligarch have, multiple satellites, multiple launch pads for helicopters and whatnot? You've got to train ordinary citizens to know what looks strange and what looks normal. And that doesn't cost very much, but it does start at a basic level of education and training for resilience.
I think I've taken up an awful lot of your time. Thank you so much. But I think I'm going to always try and round off these conversations, which can be quite gloomy, with an idea that I have for reasons to be cheerful. Alex?
Agency. I genuinely find it invigorating. I think we have got ourselves into a set of unhealthy dependencies. If it's not too psychiatric, I would say we've lost our sense of who we are. And this is our wake-up call from Trump, from Putin, and by the way, from Mario Draghi, who's called out the non-sustainability of the European economic model. So what we can do for our kids is to respond to that, accord ourselves agency, and I think we'll be quite surprised by what happens next.
Rachel, reason to be cheerful?
So I'll give you two that are related. One, more UK and Europe, and more continental Europe in the UK. I think there was a period of mutual backturning that happened after Brexit, when the reality is you're very enjoined, and when it comes to security and defense, Europe is not going to be able to succeed in this endeavor without the UK, and by extension, other non-EU countries like Norway and Turkey, if they don't bring them into the fold. So I hope we'll see less of an institutional approach to ramping up European security and defense and just taking a more pragmatic approach. And then the second would be almost completing that project of European integration. We get so hung up again on the institutions, we forget that regardless of the outcome of the war, I think it's hard to envision a future where Ukraine is not part of Europe. Economically, culturally, even in terms of security and defense, they have the second biggest army in Europe now, and probably one of the most capable, given the way that they've used emerging technologies and managed to evolve throughout the conflict. So that is pretty exciting, regardless of the stress and the tension that we're feeling now. Ukraine's not going to turn their back from Western Europe, and I hope the converse is also true.
Thank you both very much.
Thank you.
Thanks.